Hello, this briefing is another in our series for directors who have overall responsibility for health and safety within their business, but we're assuming that they have a health and safety manager in place or an external consultant in place who manages day-to-day health and safety for them. So these briefings are all about what the board needs to know to have confidence that health and safety is being managed appropriately within their business and avoid hopefully company liabilities, but also personal liabilities for getting things wrong. So today we're focusing on COSHH, the control of substances hazardous to health. I'm Sue Dearden and I'm a specialist solicitor in health and safety at Finch Consulting. And with me today is Dr. Steve Cowley, who is an occupational hygienist, and I think you've described COSHH as one of your passions, Steve.
Yes, and largely because I see so many mistakes in workplaces where I think there could be better controls. And I think directors can play a very important role in questioning whether the chemicals in the workplace are under control. There are chemicals in every workplace, and by looking for controls in place, risk assessments, and the processes to back that up is a really important part.
What would be the way in which you would normally see hazardous substances affecting people adversely?
We're obviously concerned about the presence of chemicals in the workplace, but once they become airborne, the risk dramatically increases. So we're often largely focused on airborne chemicals and prevention of inhalation. But that's not to say we shouldn't also be looking at skin absorption of chemicals or the potential for ingestion.
But the main route of absorption into the body would be breathing.
Yes, and also the main site of effect of chemicals tends to be the lungs. Dermatitis is common as a result of skin contact, but inhalation causes lung damage and also absorption of the chemical into the bloodstream.
So as a director, how would you pick up an issue? Health monitoring, perhaps?
Health monitoring is important. It's part of the arsenal in controlling the risk, but it is a bit after the fact because health monitoring is identifying when people are starting to get sick or showing symptoms. Ideally, we're getting ahead of that through risk assessments. Having identified the chemical, we undertake a risk assessment and then look for control measures that will prevent exposure.
And what sort of control measures would those be? Is there a hierarchy of how you approach them?
As with all the regulations you've been discussing, Sue, there's a hierarchy of controls and we have a hierarchy for control of chemicals. Ideally, we wish to eliminate chemicals from the workplace, which means asking, do we really need to use it? Is there an alternative way of doing this work? If we have to use a chemical, ask the question, is there a safer alternative, a substitute? And if that's not possible, then we look for engineering controls, and the last resort is personal protective equipment.
And I suppose that you can sort of carry on business with the controls in place and forget that actually things move forward, that chemicals change, substances change, and there may be something better that's out in the market. It's important to keep that under review.
Yes, we must keep reviewing the risk assessments we've undertaken, making sure that the information about the chemicals hasn't changed. We haven't learnt that they're more harmful, for example. Find out whether there's a safer alternative come onto the market. And also think about how our processes might have changed or how people using the chemical have changed the way they're undertaking the process, just in case that changes the risk.
Or could be changed, actually. It may not have changed within the workplace, but maybe should have done.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah.
And with risk assessments, I've heard you speak before about, in critical terms of quantitative risk assessments.
Yeah,
What do you mean by that?
We don't always have to rush headlong into a full-blown occupational hygiene survey to measure, quantify the concentration of a contaminant in the air, for example. What we can do is use certain qualitative techniques like a bright light source to illuminate a dust or a mist in the atmosphere, but of course that won't illuminate a gas. You will have seen it in a factory yourself when you see a shaft of light coming through a skylight. It will illuminate a contaminant in the air. That's a good example, but we can actually do that deliberately with a bright light source called a Tyndall beam. Or we can use smoke generators to see whether a ventilation system is working as part of our risk assessment. So we can do that, or we could perhaps do something semi-quantitative as a quick assessment using a colour change tube that takes it's very simple. You draw some air through a tube and it changes colour in the presence of a chemical. And our health and safety specialist can undertake that sort of work as a quick and dirty, as it were, risk assessment to save the time and money that we would be spending on a full-blown hygiene survey and spend it on the risk control measures. And then maybe later on we'll spend the money on a proper quantitative assessment to make sure our risk control measures are indeed working.
Can you tell me a little more about process-driven risk assessments?
Yeah, quite often risk assessments tend to use the safety data sheet as a basis for assessing whether anything's harmful.
Very difficult documents.
Yeah, they can be, but we must remember that all they do is tell us about the chemical as it's delivered. A chemical is used in different ways in the factory and can produce byproducts and combustion products, for example. That needs to be part of the risk assessment. So we should assess the process or the use of the chemical from its delivery through its process of use through to disposal. That's an important part as opposed to just basing it on a safety data sheet. And one way to get the front end of that right is by the director looking to see if there's a purchasing procedure which questions the use of the chemicals that are coming onto site.
That's a very good point. So you expect the purchasing director or the contracts director to have ensured that there's procedures within the team for any purchases that are to be made, not just reordering substances, but checking whether alternative better ones might be available or whether the particular one used, questioning whether it's still needed.
Absolutely, yes.
That's very helpful, thank you. And I think it's fair to say, as a final point, that the HSE has got some really good details on its website about COSHH and managing these risks, and an e-tool as well.
Yes, the COSHH Essentials tool, Google it, it comes up #1 generally. It's a really good tool for guiding you through the identification very quickly through the assessment and onto the control with some great control examples.
That's good advice, thank you. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.